This is an open letter to one of my critics. You know who you are. This is not the type of video that I ever wanted to make, and I don't intend to do another, but this time I feel like I have to. While I still consider you an ally in my attempt to counter fundamentalist pseudoscience, I also have to contest you where it is not possible to honestly agree with or accept your baseless assumptions or misrepresented misinformation, not when you've made as many false accusations as you did. Hopefully you won't continue this trend. You accused me of committing an association fallacy based on your assumption that I'm making logical leaps born of misinterpretations, neither of which I'm making. And you tried to require that I use the logical formula that you provided, which was devised to be unworkable, and therefore I shouldn't be limited to nor expected to use it. An association fallacy would be like asserting that some Christians are bad, therefore Christianity is bad. That's the same thing you falsely accused me of in our debate, though I didn't do it then either. Listing the ways that the commands of Christian doctrine are and have historically been dangerous is not an association fallacy. If the basic tenets of the faith tell people that God says it doesn't matter what they take into their bodies, that they can hold venomous snakes and drink bleach and all that, and it won't hurt them if they can just make believe hard enough, or that they should murder rape victims or even kill their own family and friends who don't share those beliefs, those are dangerous lessons to teach, even if most Christians disregard those bits of doctrine because the believers are generally better than their religion. Sure, this is the infallible word of a just and loving God, and that's why we ignore all the bits that prove that it's obviously the words of men, not God, and certainly not any God worthy of worship. You dismissed all my examples as just Christians behaving badly, including my specific references to Jesus promoting slavery, among other dangerous ideas. Yet you now deny dismissing him right along with the rest of my list the way you definitely did. You also denied that the Bible actually does endorse capital punishment for LGBTQ people. You said the Bible doesn't say that, even though it certainly does. Or maybe you meant that it doesn't mean that anymore, because God's eternal and unchanging word changed when Christians changed it, when they made up the idea of a new covenant so they could pretend that whatever the Old Testament says doesn't matter anymore, except whenever y'all say it still does. You accused me of quote mining, but you cherry-picked a line out of Hebrews that directly contradicts what Jesus said in another verse that you yourself cited, where Jesus specified that we had better follow every jot and tittle of all those old Mosaic laws, because if we break even one of them, we will be called least in heaven, and whoever practices every last one of those 613 Jewish commandments will be called great in heaven. That's what it actually says, in context. You said that I provided no empirical evidence that Christianity causes bad behavior, ignoring the list of historical atrocities that were endorsed and enforced by Christian clergy and driven by Christian conviction, earning Christianity the title of bloodiest religion in history. That was the cited opinion of others, although you said that was just my personal opinion or experience, which you know is not true. If such inhuman cruelty is promoted by your God and committed in the name of Jesus, then that's not an attribution error like you said it was. That's an accurate attribution. But you tried to wave that away as if that's just my interpretation. You asked for peer-reviewed studies proving that Christianity is dangerous when the Holocaust and the Mormon execution order and numerous other examples I already cited prove that. Obviously, no one's going to do a peer-reviewed study to show whether a mother murdering her children to protect them from Satan is dangerous, and we already know how mental illness can be cloaked in and thus enabled by religion. Regarding the studies that you cited, you asked why I said they were a dodge. Because, as I said in our debate, what they showed was only that some isolated aspect of Christianity may not be necessarily dangerous if that belief is only intrinsic, meaning that it is only for its own sake, described as a framework of life, which is fortunately nowadays usually interpreted only as being good people and ignoring much of what the Bible actually says to the contrary, which you do. It's much the same argument I often hear from believers asking, what is the harm in believing whatever we want, even if it isn't true? But the reality is that the very concept of intrinsic religiosity was invented to counter a number of studies that showed a positive correlation with prejudice, meaning that the more religious one is, the more prejudiced they tend to be. Intrinsic religion is less so. Extrinsic religion, definitely more so. So that serves your purpose only by omission. because you admitted that Christianity really is dangerous when believers act on those beliefs extrinsically, meaning that they use their religion as a means to an end. In other words, whenever religion does something to further its own agenda. Thus, you can only say that Christianity is not dangerous by pushing out of sight that box of everything that is obviously too sharp or explosive and only looking at the prettier box of relatively soft, fluffy things. That other box still matters. And given this argument, we could just as easily debate whether Islam or any other religion is dangerous, and your own demand to show peer-reviewed studies of intrinsic religion would show the same type of result. Once you negate the means of any belief to further its religious agenda, believers in whatever religion could make the same claim of harmless faith that you did, even when any extrinsic action taken by that religion could be potentially lethal or an attack on human rights. Your argument was a dodge because it evades the point that you quietly admitted, that beliefs inform actions and that when your religion acts, it is dangerous. Your argument was similar to saying that a bear isn't dangerous when it's asleep, or that having a gun in your house isn't dangerous, just as long as no one is ever tempted to do anything with it. Although I would argue that just having religion is dangerous, and I gave a specific example of its adverse effect on children. Remember when I said this? Even the slightest acceptance of Christianity still requires some denial of natural science, even if it's just making believe things that are not evidently or even possibly true, like the soul, for example, because you have to believe that, or else you'll face the empty threat of a fate worse than death if you don't make yourself believe. There's a definite danger to your ability to reason if you've been conditioned that you must believe man-made mythology of impossible absurdity and for no good reason, even when all the evidence says otherwise. And yes, there are peer-reviewed studies to prove what I said. For example, this study shows that non-religious children are more capable of distinguishing fact from fiction than religious children, who are more susceptible to deceptive fantasies, just like I already predicted they would be. We didn't really need a study to confirm what we knew was already obvious, right? And notice that we're also only talking about intrinsic religiosity here. Another study published in the journal Religions shows that there can be beneficial effects to any religion if the whole family or community shares that same belief and don't confront other beliefs, in which case all those advantages would be lost. And this again is intrinsic religiosity. Yet despite whatever psychological advantage comes from this, the study also shows that students' performance on reading, math, and science tests were all recognizably hampered by several forms of parental religiosity, even when it is merely intrinsic. And sticking just to intrinsic Christianity, we then have scientific studies that prove that nothing fails like prayer. And not only do prayers not help make anything better, they actually make things worse, even health-related situations, such that prayer fails even in the one instance where it should at least have a placebo effect. So should we even give this topic any more study? But even if there was no detriment at all to intrinsic religiosity, the answer to the yes or no question of whether Christianity is dangerous is still definitely yes. You don't get to pretend that extrinsic Christianity doesn't exist or doesn't count, as if ignoring the most dangerous bits would mean that the unified collective isn't still dangerous. You showed an image of Stephen Anderson, leader of the Independent Fundamental Baptists, who advocate killing disobedient children as the Bible says we should. You said that it would not be a no true Scotsman fallacy for you to dismiss such religious extremists who interpret Scripture differently from the way that you do. But no, you can say they're bad Christians, and I'll agree with you, since they're bad people. But you can't say that they're not truly Christian as if they're not Christian at all. Though I do wish you guys would agree on a universal definition of what a Christian is, because different denominations seem to have different ideas about that. Also, however you choose to interpret your scriptures doesn't change the fact that what you call the Word of God really does advocate killing disobedient children, even though Christians now make excuses to ignore that part. There are also things that you know Christianity teaches that are not in the Bible, but are common Christian interpretations of what the scriptures really don't say. You criticized me for pointing that out too, saying that nowhere in the Bible does it say that children will go to hell if they don't believe. But even if that's not in the Bible, you know that Christianity teaches that anyway, and you told my wife that you even believe that yourself. So your hypocrisy is showing, sir. As science has a requirement that all postulations must be based on a prerequisite of supportive evidence, then assuming things that are not evidently supported would be a rejection of scientific principle. You say that assuming a soul without evidence is justified because of your unwarranted assumption that it's not part of nature. And that only confirms what I said, that it is an unsupported assertion of a baseless assumption with no discernible truth to it. In this case, it's not just that it's not evidently true, it's evidently not true. It's not just that there's no evidence for it, there's evidence against it too. And you said theology is not logically impossible, but there are many claims in theology that are not logical, and none of them are rational. You can't even show a precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon to indicate that what you believe is even possibly true. So it would be dishonest to say that it is. That's an empty assertion. And we are talking about man-made mythology of impossible absurdities that are obviously born of imaginative fantasy, but that have no basis in reality. And I have to add that apologetics arguments duck and dodge or even obfuscate the burden of proof. They do not in any sense meet that burden. Having absolutely no basis in fact, still, even after all these centuries, is not an increasingly strong position like you tried to make it out to be. Your primary criticism against me is the semantics of Koine Greek, as if that changes the current English word or could be different from the previous Hebrew. Yet you cite in your vacuous attack a passage to love thy neighbor, which is a reference to community unity, which you said was extrinsic, not intrinsic, and I think you're mistaken about that. But the verse you referred to was a repeated line that actually means, or actually meant originally, love your fellow Jew as yourself, which contradicts what Jesus said in Matthew 10 about how you're supposed to hate yourself and your whole family, but it reinforces the message that Jews are chosen people and that Jesus didn't want his gospel to be given to Gentiles or Samaritan dogs, as he described them. Because Jesus' character is that of a provincial and ethnocentric faith healer, no better than we see on TV today, but a more primitive one with no concept of the world as a whole, much less its relevance in the cosmos. In your attempt to accuse me of every fallacy you know a name for, you of course included the straw man fallacy, which I never use. Doesn't matter, because every time I describe something correctly but pejoratively, I get accused of straw manning, even when every word I use in that description is defensively accurate. Likewise, you described my correct explanation of the God of the Gaps fallacy as if it was a fallaciously circular argument, assuming again things I never thought or implied and assigning to me a philosophical position that you already know I don't hold, just to misrepresent me however you can, assuming I assumed things I didn't assume and you shouldn't have assumed that I did. Incidentally, materialism is nothing more than not assuming fanciful notions that are not evidently true and therefore shouldn't be asserted as if they were or even could be. Then, on top of all that, after I gave my honest opinion and perspective as well as a well-reasoned and well-supported argument, you called me a liar. That's typical. Christians often accuse me of lying every time they disagree with me, even when they can't show that anything I said was factually false, much less deceptive. But I have no reason to lie, because I have no faith to defend like you do. Unlike you, I am free to change my mind if the evidence compels me to do so, or if I find that it fails to adequately support whatever I shouldn't believe already. The only advantage I have over you is that I can show the truth of my position where you cannot. Thus, any dishonesty on my part would undermine the one thing I believe in, being the value of truth itself. The goal of some apologists may be to defend the faith against all reason, and many have admitted exactly that, but my goal is to improve understanding, my own as well as others. You can't do that if you won't admit your own mistakes or correct them. So my information has to be accurate or it's worthless, and errors must be admitted and corrected at first opportunity. That's why I have no reason to lie about any of this, the way believers do and demonstrably will. So don't call me a liar just because you disagree with me or because you didn't understand what I said, which is common too, or because you want me to interpret things more charitably than they deserve. You shouldn't call anyone a liar unless you can immediately show that what they said was wrong and that they knew it was wrong when they said it as an attempt at deception. If you accuse someone of lying when what they said wasn't even wrong, then it's like calling check prematurely or sinking the cue ball along with the 8. You lose even when you might have won. It makes you the liar. I didn't contradict myself either. I said that many Christians will admit that religious faith does not depend on scientific evidence, but that those who debate that say that I'm using the wrong definition, even though I can cite many supportive references right from their own scripture, as well as many other scriptures, to show that I'm right, and they can't produce one citation that backs their claim without contradiction, and two, they can't ever cite any actual testable empirical evidence that would qualify in the context we're talking about. How can you pretend that faith, or pistis if you prefer, even could be based on scientific evidence if you already know that no such evidence exists? Now, on the definition of faith, this is where we actually agree, though you somehow don't understand or didn't realize that. You admitted that the common mainstream definition that I use for the word faith in English is not incorrect, that I'm wholly justified in saying that religious faith is not dependent on scientific evidence. Your friend Erick Hernandez admitted that too. You said that faith is not about rational inquiry. It's an act of volition. It's a confidence or loyalty, and I agree completely. I always have, and I said so. But then you said that faith is something you do after you reason. How can you reason your way into any religion when none of them can show any actual factual truth to their claims? Not even enough to distinguish their belief from the delusions of pure imagination. A weak induction fallacy, which you also falsely accused me of, is when the premise is not strong enough to support the conclusion. Yet, you are proposing things that are not supported by your premises, and you're actually criticizing me for not doing the same thing that you are. You ignored that I did, in fact, include references to actual scholars who explained the definition of faith that I use, but none of that was an appeal to authority like you said it was. Many of these are not authorities. I list them because your fans have repeatedly alleged that faith, as a belief that is not dependent on evidence, is somehow my own personal definition. This assortment of quotes from earlier sources prove that your fans are wrong, that the definition that I use is not one of my own making, but the main one already in common parlance since long before I was born. Do you have to misunderstand or misrepresent everything? Well, if you're an apologist, it seems that answer must be yes. You brought up having faith in my wife, too, but that is the fallacy of equivocation, mixing different definitions or contexts with deceptive effect. I did specify that we are only talking about religious faith, and no, your trust in God is not based on scientific evidence. Not in your case, and not in any other believer's case either. Your doctrine is explicit on this point. You are commanded to believe, or else be damned if you don't, regardless of evidence. Now, deny that all you want, but that is the truth.
No, Aaron, being told to believe something just because we are told is not inherent in the Greek word pistis. What is your source for this? No ancient Greek scholar says this, as far as I'm aware.
I think what these people are asking for, when they're asking for an expert, they're asking for the expert who agrees with them. Their seminary, their theology, their apologists have come up with their usage of the word, and those of us who use it a different way are somehow outsiders. So you're never going to satisfy those people until you find an expert. And you're right, why do we even need experts? Why can't we just pick it up and read it?
Yeah, well, somebody asked me for to quote a theologian, and you were on a list, and they saw your name and reacted because you were an atheist, therefore you are not a theologian. And the common concept of theologian that I looked up was, somebody that has academic scholarship in the study of religion, and preferably the common understanding is that person would also have an understanding of ancient Greek or Hebrew or what have you. And even that strictest definition describes yourself, sir. So it was a little bit irritating to have people criticize that you don't count somehow. There's some way to dismiss you as not being a theologian.
Well, on the one hand, it is true. I don't earn my living as a professional theologian, so that's kind of true.
Well, but there was no specification that you have to be professional. Matter of fact, I saw a number of Christian websites that were advocating that every Christian should be a theologian in the sense that they should pursue an academic or a scholarly, an educational, a scholarly sense of what is theology and what is the knowledge of God. And so by that looser definition, which Christian groups are advocating for, you would be called a former theologian, in which case, still.
and for example, the word priest, with the Reformation, with Martin Luther and all those, they rebelled against the idea that priests were only these special clergy appointed by the Catholic Church. And the Baptist Church now, for example, has the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. So they're all communicating with God directly. So the word theologian really doesn't mean anything. Theology is the study of God. And since God is a concept and not an actual thing, there's a phrase that I coined, theology is a subject with no object. And even if you disagree with that, even if you disagree that theology is a subject with no object, you can't avoid the fact that all these theologians who are experts all disagree with each other. So when you say you need to be a theologian, which theologian, which theology, which school, which seminary, which degree? Because you don't have to be an expert to see that all the experts disagree with each other. So really it's a matter of picking your expert, and most people tend to pick the experts that fit within their own theology, with their own particular view. So yeah, I have a degree in religion, but I'm not bragging about it. I got a degree in religion from Azusa Pacific University. I studied 2 years of Koine Greek. I translated much of the New Testament from Greek into English, which is no big deal. I mean, it's really not that big a deal to translate from one language to another. Koine Greek, it turns out, is not a very precise and exact language anyway. It was sort of more of a street language at the time. It's certainly more corrupt or more degraded than what we would call classical Greek, which seemed to be a lot more precise. So I'm not claiming that I'm a great Greek scholar, but you don't have to be, because what's the mystery? A language is a language, and it can be translated into another language. And yeah, there's a lot of debates among translators. If you pick, what are there, about 80 or 90 different English translations of the Bible? Many of them disagree with each other, and each one of them had scholars, professional scholars who were experts in the language translating those, and you'll pick up different English versions that have different words for those same words. So there's a lot of leeway, there's some discretion, there's some arguments about what these words actually mean. When it comes to the word faith, you won't find an agreement. Different theologians have different definitions of the word faith as applied in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Some say it's just trust. Some say faith is, like I have faith in the character of my dad, because I know my dad's a good man, and I might be wrong. He might be a serial murderer, who knows, but I'm going to go with it. I'm going to have faith from what based on kind of a rational basis. There's that definition. But the Bible, the New Testament definition, and this is one of those rare words in the Bible where we actually have a definition. We don't have definitions of the word evil or wicked or a lot of these things. We have to infer their definitions from usage. But in the Bible, in Hebrews 11, we have an exact definition. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And if you look through the New Testament, you see the word faith used all the time in the sense of believing something without evidence. You can see it belief with evidence as well. Just like the character of my dad is based on some evidence that I'm rounding off to say he's a good man, admitting I might be wrong. You find all kinds of verses like the prayer of faith will heal the sick, for example. It says in James, if there's anybody sick among you, let the elders come, anoint their head, and the prayer of faith will heal the sick. So if faith is based on rational principles, if faith is a leap above what's reasonable, then what's reasonable is to observe that verse doesn't work. Reasonably, scientifically, the prayer of faith does not heal the sick. Once in a while there's some coincidence, but in general, it does not heal the sick. So a rational faith would have no choice but to conclude that Bible verse is wrong. When Jesus said, all things whatsoever you shall ask for in prayer, believing, you shall receive. All things is what he said. He didn't say maybe or some of it or once in a while or if you're good. He said all things, whatever you ask for in prayer, believing, which is faith, you shall receive. So a rational faith would be forced to conclude that Bible verse at least is wrong. Rationally, that is a bad, wrong teaching. And that's not how most Christian apologists use the word faith. They think there is enough evidence, like the resurrection of Jesus, maybe, or maybe a prophecy, or maybe miracles, or maybe changed lives, or they think there's some evidence out there. It's not 100%, but it gives you a basis upon which then you can base your faith and make that additional leap above and beyond. That's what they're saying, but that's not what the Bible says. And the Bible doesn't define faith in any sort of rational apologetic way.
Well, I've always specified that when I'm talking about faith in contrast with reason, then we're talking about religious faith, and the evidence that we're talking about is, I'm only talking about scientific evidence, because I'm aware that people will call all kinds of subjective impressions or arguments from authority or assumed conclusions, circular reasoning. There's fallacious evidence that you could cite, but we're talking about scientific evidence. And one of the things that one of my critics says, well, he asked me to find a scholar in Koine Greek who would say that pistis is defined as denying evidence or reason, which I never said. I said that in the context and the way that pistis is used, even if we accept that it is a trust, it is a trust that you are commanded to believe or else, and you will be damned if you don't believe. But it's not that you are given evidence, nor are you permitted to change your mind if the evidence dissuades you. If no amount of evidence is ever allowed to disprove a faith-based belief. You're just supposed to believe that regardless of evidence. And now I'm talking to somebody who I would at least consider to be a scholar in Koine Greek. Could you tell me if what I'm saying is accurate? Because the critic tells me that the implication that we believe what the Bible tells us to believe simply because the Bible tells us to believe it, and not because of an overwhelming preponderance of evidence, as he says, that's not implied in any of the cited examples.
Yeah, so scholars would not agree with each other on this. I think what's happening is they're cherry picking. So you can't take the word pisti or pistis or pistos, whatever, any of those words based upon that root. You cannot take it and find one exact exclusive definition. You'll find all sorts of usages and definitions. And if you want, you can pick a couple of verses that say, see, look, here's how we are using the word and understanding the word. I think there's a lot of Christian apologists who want to feel like their faith is rationally justified. They don't want to feel like stupid, mindless people who are just believing whatever. They want to feel like their faith that they have invested in Jesus and in the Bible makes some kind of sense. And so it's embarrassing that to them, to this type, it's not embarrassing to all of them. There's a whole bunch of maybe extreme Pentecostals and others who are total faith, who even in spite of contrary evidence, they're going to believe it.
Yeah, one of my critics criticized me, saying imagined that I was contradicting myself when I said that a number of Christians will make this admission. They're actually proud that they believe something that is entirely based on faith and not based on evidence, but that those who debate this point with me then want to bring up evidence. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be doing an interview tomorrow with somebody who says he has scientific evidence of God, but that's what they never produce. And the guy tomorrow, I'm certain that what he's going to present is something that science can't explain this, and then he's going to assume that means it's evidence for God. But yeah, it's a God of the gaps fallacy. And again, fallacies are not evidence.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there's different Christians that have different interpretations, and there's more fights between Christians than there are between Christians and atheists. I mean, there's more denominational splits and all that. And I guess the basic question is, why? If the Bible's clear, if the Bible is this inspired word from this loving, caring God to you and me, then it should be really clear. When you open up a drawer in the hotel room and you find a Gideon Bible there is no expert and scholar sitting there next to you pointing to each word saying, by the way, here's what the original means. If that's required to understand this book that God wrote to us, then God is inept. He did a very bad, very sloppy job of communicating his message. And why is it even in the hotel room if I can't even understand it without some, seminary graduate or somebody with a degree in theology explaining it to me? You and I should be able to just pick it up. Same thing with the Quran or any other religious right. You and I, if it's from a God and it's from a God to you and to me, including to us atheists, then we should be able to just pick it up and read it and go, yep, that's what it means. And if there's fights and disagreements about that, if you need one of your Christian friends to explain to you what it really, really means, Well, that means they're doing God's work better than God did himself, because he failed to make his case.
Let me just get a couple clarifying questions out. You not only specialized in Koine Greek, you actually taught Koine Greek for a time, didn't you?
Yeah. So yes and no, I suppose. I got a master's of theology from Capital Bible Seminary, where I took under Thomas Edgar. I studied Koine Greek and read it for 6 years. Then, of course, during the PhD, I did a lot of not a lot, but some Septuagintal work. So I'm always reticent to call myself an expert on anything. And certainly there are people that are vastly more competent. Excuse me. Vastly more competent in the field. But I mean, I know my way around the New Testament, I guess.
Okay, so it has always been my contention that that the way that a word is used, or what, you might have a meaning of a word, but then in this case, we're talking about an implication that would have to be implied by the context in which it is used.
Hmm.
And in every case that I've ever seen, and I have a number of examples throughout Scripture, you are told to believe or else. You are told to believe because this is what you have to do, or you're going to go to hell if you don't. You're told to believe with some sort of an implication that you have to trust the authority of whoever is telling you to believe. Right? Believe me because I said so is the kind of way I read it. And my critics in Christianity want to insist that they're being told that something, it's to believe something simply because you were told to, is not inherent in the Greek word pistis. And I'm saying it's not part of the word, it's not part of a definition of the word, but it is in the context that it is used in Scripture that is implied that you are to believe, not because the evidence has compelled you, but because the authority demands it.
Yeah, I mean, pistis in and of itself is a complex word, as you've pointed out a number of times. And so whether you go to the synoptics, or you go to John, or you go to the epistles, or even the later pastoral epistles, or Hebrews, and even in these books, there can be variations within the way that they're used. If your listeners are looking for a good place to start on this, you can look at something like the Anchor Bible Dictionary, or they can go pick up Bauer, Dankerart, and Gingrich, which is a New Testament Greek English lexicon. And they can, pistis is there, and it'll break down the different ways that the word is used, not only in the New Testament text, but also in early Christian literature. And one of the things that I think is really important, and I watched the debate, and then I've listened to some of the follow-up things, and I feel like there are some things that I don't know if you're talking past them, or if they're just looking for something to try to pick on. I'm not sure.
I get the impression that because they keep trying to accuse me of every logical fallacy they know a name for, even when none of those, by definition of what they are and what I'm saying, that's clearly not the case. So I think they're just they're grasping at whatever straw they can to try to find something to accuse me of, so that they can. That's what it looks like to me. I mean, because I get accused of all these fallacies. How can you accuse me of this?
I know it's a bit of an aside, but to sort of camp on that for a second. When Erick Hernandez came on and said, well, you said that you've been doing this for 20 years and it's actually been 17 years and now it's been 22 years and you haven't updated your script. I was listening to that and I thought, well, God, I guess I'm a liar, because I've said I've been a Christian for 25 years. And every time I say it now, I have to think, all right, now wait a minute. Well, what was it? So I was 5 or 6. Was I 6? I don't remember. So then, and when did I actually, so that sort of thing, I think it just sort of goes to this. It's very disingenuous, and I think just trying to grab onto something. But it's interesting to me because I was having a conversation recently with someone, and the analogy was made, and I think it's a really great analogy. And you hear it all the time with Christian apologists, and he actually even said that, and he is not a Christian apologist. It's like, faith is like sitting in a chair, right? And I don't know that the chair is going to hold me up. But when I sit down, I have faith that it will. And I said the problem, and I think the fundamental problem with that analogy is that in this analogy, you've never sat in the chair, right? If we're talking about belief in the biblical text, you're talking about belief in a chair that you've never sat in, right? Now, if we're trying to go back to the context of, Abraham and Moses, even in those contexts, people that have walked and talked with God, even those circumstances, their faith is lauded because they believed things that went against what they saw as reality. So Abraham is told time and again, look out, count the stars in the sky, the dust before you. Your descendants will be this way. And Abraham goes, I'm really old. My wife's really old, past the age of giving birth. And God says, trust me, have faith. Right. Well, faith is saying in that circumstance, trust have confidence, right?
In what I say simply because I said so.
Right. Because, and of course, the implication of the biblical text is because it's God, and God is always faithful, and God, brings those things to pass that are not. But essentially speaking, I mean, this is the point. I mean, you're looking at things as though they are not. That's what you're doing. So when in the book of Hebrews, for example, Hebrews chapter 11, the big chapter, that everybody goes to about faith, this is perseverance. Right? This is a perseverance chapter saying, look, think back, look at the track record that God had, right? And even in that circumstance, he goes and he lists the people that believed God but never saw the promise. It never saw those things come about, and yet they persevered. And I think that's the essential character. So, I was talking to another friend of mine, a very strong evangelical Christian from my days at Hopkins. We were best friends there. And he has a very similar background to me. And he said, I said, so I mean, we were talking about this in particular. And I said, like, how do you know, that the God that you believe in is the God of the Bible? Right? I mean, how do you reconcile that? And he said, well, here. It's a subjective experience, right? And he said, I'm very, I mean, this is a very intelligent and very, very intelligent man. And he said, I'm fully aware of that. He said, but I have faith, and my belief allows me to say, I know that God exists, and it's the God of the Bible, like I know the sun's going to come up tomorrow, right? And I think that's the essential character of faith, right? Now, when we talk about Pistis in this way, I think it's absolutely critical to recognize that from the perspective of the biblical text, they're basing that forward-looking faith, that forward-looking trust and confidence on God's fidelity. They're looking back and they're saying, we know God's character. And that's what he said. I know the character of the God that I serve. The problem, I think, and this is what I keep hearing you say, is that we're not sitting in that chair. We haven't had the experience of sitting in that chair and having it hold us up. We're looking at a book from 2,000 years ago, from 2,500 years ago, that says people sat in this chair and it held them up. And so you don't have that direct connection. You don't have that direct evidence. What you have is, I think, ultimately subjectivity. And you have to say that I look around at things and I see God working, and because of that, I believe that if I persevere in this, well, first of all, I believe that because of these evidences that I see subjectively, God, doing things around me, working things out in my life, those sorts of things, that the biblical texts are true. It corresponds to reality in a way that nothing else does. And because of that, I will persevere. I will hold on and believe and have this faith that allows me to, in the face of things that appear completely to the contrary, I will still hold on and persevere. And I'll stop talking in a second. I apologize, Aaron. But
that's why I wanted to talk to you, so I could hear your opinion.
I think it's 2 Peter 2 Peter 3, where Peter's talking about, or the writer of 2 Peter's talking about scoffers that are going to come in the last days, and they're going to say, "Yeah, where is the sign of his coming? You know, all things continue on since creation." And the text is saying, I think very clear. The point of the text is that people are looking around at the evidence, right, at what they see, and they're saying, "Look, your faith, your belief system," using that more in in a substantive sense there, a body of truth, your body of truth that is your faith, is saying that these things are going to come about, and yet we don't see that. In fact, we see the opposite happening. Therefore, your God's not real, your God's not going to do what you say, those sorts of things. And Peter's response is to say, have faith, right? God isn't, he's not slack. He's not being slack as men consider slackness. He's being patient, right? In other words, there's a way that it's really early apologetics, I think, right? Let's look at this a different way to try to justify, to give a rationale as to why God hasn't come back and broken through and done these things like we anticipated he was going to. And it's because he's being patient with the world. He's actually being even more loving. Could that be true? Sure. Do I think that's true? No, I don't think that's plausible. I don't think that's. I don't think that's a likely.
Say probable. It doesn't.
That's not probable. Yes, that was the word I was searching for. Thank you. So, yeah.
Yeah, I read that the root meaning of pistis can be summed up as convincing or persuasion via force. That forced trust, forced belief is the meaning of pistis. That it can all evidently be traced back to the PIE word, and then I don't know how to pronounce that, meaning to trust, which is the thematic root verb of the word biend, with the primary meaning appearing to be to compel or force. And I'm guessing that means to convince here, but obviously not, with evidence. And then the last line is, all of this is evidently cited from an Oxford study on the matter. But I don't have the person who wrote that, I don't have them here to explain exactly what they mean. Perhaps you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like what they're trying to get at is that the story that I gave when I was pastoring out in Virginia talked about, and I'm certainly not the only one that has done this, but a little boy that's standing up on a deck, and his father's down on the ground 7 feet below, and he says, "Jump." Now, to that little boy, his dad's 7 feet down. That's a long way down, and he knows that when you hit the ground after falling that far, it really hurts. But he looks at his father, and his father says, "I will catch you." So he's making himself trust by acting, right? He's saying, "Yes, I'm putting my trust. I'm having faith." And you can almost picture the boy closing his eyes and kind of jumping off. Indiana Jones, right? And the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Is that the right one? That's not right.
No.
But the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Where he's standing at that chasm, right? You have to believe. You have to believe. He's not walking across that chasm like it's a sidewalk because he can't see it. That's the point. He's got to stand there, sweat running down his face, and he puts that leg way up in the air and falls forward. Because he that's what it sounds like that definition is going at. He's making himself have faith in that object.
Again, we are not doing it because this is indicated by evidence. Again, this is because this is what you're told to believe.
And it's in the face in many cases, even in the biblical text. That's the whole point. It's in the face of looking around and saying, it doesn't seem like this is the case. In fact, it seems like very much the opposite is the case. You read through the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is specifically written, many parts of it, as many texts are of that genre, to keep the community going, to keep the community persevering, and say, have faith. He's going to overcome. And so And the thing is, I don't think that any of the people that have criticized you would say anything against anything that I've said here. And that's why.
Well, here's the strange thing about what they do. I mean, I got into it with Erick Hernandez, right? And he's angry that I've misdefined faith. And then when I tell him what I said twice in the debate, I said that that faith is based on subjective impressions. I admit that there can be subjective evidence, but obviously subjective evidence is not reason for me. I need objective evidence. We're talking about empirical evidence. We're talking about something testable. We're talking about scientific evidence. I've always clarified that.
Of course.
Well, when we're talking to creationists, it's given that I'm clarifying that. But
I listened to that, Aaron. I listened to that debate again between you and Michael this morning, and you must have said scientific evidence about 10 times. I mean, it wasn't in short supply. You saying scientific evidence. I mean, I don't. Well, that's why it was baffling to me.
Thank you. I can only remember having specified that twice, but one of the times was in the presentation itself, where I said you can have faith is based on subjective impressions. It could be arguments from authority. Of course, you assume the authority, just like the leap of faith, like we're talking about, or it can be logical fallacies. And I've been given a lot of logical fallacies in defense of faith. But I said it can be based on anything but scientific evidence. And then when Erick Hernandez asked his question, he gave the general thing that like the equivocation thing, where you can switch over to whether we have faith in our wives or whatever. And so I interrupted his question to clarify that we're only talking about religious faith, and that religious faith is not dependent on scientific evidence. And he thanked me for the clarification, and then continued with an answer that was wrong, and continued to attack me for it. And I made what the most important point I think I could make of anybody, and I've heard lots of people say that they have scientific evidence for God, but nobody's ever able to produce any, right? And so Inspiring Philosophy, I forget his real name, he's
Michael Jones,
me that I'm misdefining that, but he doesn't have scientific evidence. Nobody has scientific evidence. So why are they even bothering to argue with this?
That was
they don't have it, so what is the point?
That was the thing that I think was most confusing to me about Erick Hernandez's question, because what he seemed to be saying was, you've been doing this for 20 years. Surely you'd be able to recall, like his litmus test almost, to see if you actually had been studying Christianity. I mean, if the debate was about the ills of Christianity in the world, and whether it's good or bad, that the litmus test to see if you'd been doing this for 20 years was you could name a Greek scholar, someone who specializes in Koine Greek, that defines faith the way that you do.
No, not the way that I do. That was the other thing, that defines faith in a way that I don't.
Oh, right.
Do you know any scholars who specialize in Koine Greek who would define pistis as denying evidence or reason, which of course is not my argument.
Right.
So that is actually a straw man, a literal straw man fallacy. So this is one of a list of fallacies that Inspiring Philosophy used against me while accusing me of a list of fallacies that do not apply. So it looks like he's just desperately trying to find whatever he can to colorize this in some way. But it was a straw man, because that's not the argument that I make. I was stating that pistis is implied in the context. Like look, for example, at Proverbs, right? Trust in God with all your might and lean not on your own understanding, right? So you're not supposed to know things. You're just supposed to believe what you're told. Am I reading that wrong? Is that the way that that's written?
I mean, I'd have to go back and look at the Hebrew and see how the Septuagint translates.
Well, that would be good if you would do that, because and I wouldn't mind if you did that right now, because you're fluent in Hebrew as well, right?
Yeah,
So would not the Greek pistis be based on Hebrew? I mean, the Hebrew concept, it is the same word, is it not?
So the Hebrew, it's a little complex. So the Hebrew root, aleph mem nun, it was a little. It's been said that I'm trying to remember who said it. It might have been Healy that said the Old Testament doesn't define faith; it describes it.
Yeah,
and I think that's probably a fair way to
But again, it's never because of, it's not like the quote that I put in my response video where I put in a quote attributed to the Buddha where he says, don't believe things because you're told to, don't believe it because you read it, believe it because that's what the evidence indicates after you have studied it, right? So, I mean, that's what it would mean. If faith was based on evidence, that's the kind of description it would give. But we don't ever have a description that is remotely like that anywhere in the scriptures, not in the Christian scriptures, not in the Jewish, not in Hindu scriptures, not in Islam. We always have descriptions of faith as being believe what you're told simply on the authority of those who claim it, or because you're going to go to hell if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, and I've got it up here, and I'll look at it in just a second. I think that probably the most important thing that I think either is being missed or maybe I just haven't heard, maybe I haven't heard all of their responses where they explain this. I'm not sure. But as it stands right now, what I don't understand is there's a difference between how the biblical text presents God's fidelity and Christ's fidelity, which is solid, right? Which is unwavering, which is fully, I mean, that's the whole point. You can absolutely trust in God, right? And that's how it's presented. So if you were to ask a biblical author, do you believe, do you think that you have good reasons to believe that? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, look at the Exodus and look at what God did in creation. And, excuse me.
To my experience, they very commonly claim evidence, but it is never scientific evidence, which is why I always have to specify.
Yeah.
So when they tell me, every time they tell me that faith is not a belief that is not based on evidence, faith depends on evidence. And what is the evidence? Well, it's the scripture. It's the circular argument of believing what you believe because you believe it.
And that's where I think this is sort of getting lost.
I've also been accused of this. I said that IP told me that you can't believe something simply because you force yourself to believe it. Yet, I have encountered countless religious believers who do exactly that, who brag that is what they do.
I mean, I think this is where I think words are getting, different usages of words are getting mixed up. Like the whole point of the text, when Jesus says, essentially, I think it's in Mark 4, why don't you have more faith? It said, you cowards, well, why is it that you don't have faith? And then they say, wow, even he, calms the sea, even the sea or, the winds, and listen and obey his voice. Again, these are Indiana Jones moments that we're talking about here, where you're having to say, in the face of adversity, in the face of God seemingly not being here, trust, believe. That's why this is also very baffling to me.
Lack of evidence. That's the implication in every.
It's in the face of evidence to the contrary. I mean, that's what it is. But I think that the bigger thing here is that in the biblical text, it's assumed belief in, particularly in the Old Testament text, it's belief in the God of creation, the God of Israel, and that's assumed. So when you get to the New Testament text, it's belief in the resurrection, right? There's development that's taken place there, and so you hear. I think it'd be arguable that you hear a lot more about faith, but the thing is, when you see like in the Pauline text, like something like 1 Corinthians 15. They have this basis where they can say, oh, look, I saw, he saw, you saw, and look, these 500 other people. So you can go ask them if you want to. So in that sense, they would say, yeah, we have evidence, right?
Except that even in those cases, they don't have anybody you can go ask.
Right.
I mean, they often use this thing. Many people saw it. It was widely known. Everybody knows this, and so you're supposed to be convinced by that. Like when Jesus died, and in one account we have like the earthquake and everything breaking in half, and the sun going dark for hours, and then we have undead saints. So these are Jewish saints, right? That are wandering around undead, and many people saw them, and we're supposed to buy that. And clearly, there was no undead anything. There was no people creeping out of their graves, and there was no hundreds of people who saw that. And I saw similar things with, like an entire town in Mexico saw the Madonna appear in the sky. So like everybody can see there's 500 people. And how can you question 500 people seeing this? Well, I can question it because I'm reading it in the Weekly World News, which is a magazine that is known to have lied about an awful lot of stuff. So I think they're just lying about 500 people having seen this.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets back to like in John 20:29. I mean, I think that's the best argument. Everybody brings this up. Well, they bring up the perverse immediately before that.
Sure.
They say, well, doubting Thomas needed evidence, and he got evidence, so that's proof that faith is based on evidence. And I'm like, well, are you ignoring the very next thing that's said there, where Jesus said that you believe because you had evidence, right? Because you see me. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet believe. And what does that mean? That means that you are not blessed if you believe on evidence. That the true faith, and I've seen this in scholarly articles as well, that the true faith is those who believe even when there is no evidence. And this is scholarly journals that I'm reading now. But they're not New Testament scholars. There's always got to be an excuse, right? So you can't be just that this is what it says. In English, in Hebrew, in Arabic, it doesn't matter that other religions, it doesn't matter that older religions have the same context of faith. Always believe what I say because I say, and that it never describes a necessity of evidence, or you're not permitted to change your mind either. So even if there was evidence that you could have, you can't base it on that because you're not allowed to change your mind about it. You can never let evidence disrupt or disprove a faith-based belief. That's forbidden.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I know I keep saying that, but it's why this baffles me so much, because there's a difference between, when you get to the book of John, there are a lot of things that are different about John in this respect than the synoptics, because John's, you start to get statements about this proof, right? These things are written, and even in the later epistles, this idea that, look, we can hear these witnesses, and we saw these things, we touched them, we handled them. So they're providing that basis. Now, the reason for that, I mean, just assuming for a second the absolute validity of the entirety of the New Testament. Let's just assume that for the sake of argument, right? The rationale here is that, look, this person is risen, right? And because of that, he's able to bear that weight of absolute fidelity, right? And you can trust him because things are going to be coming in the very near term where you're going to want to not persevere. You're going to want to leave the faith, right? And don't, because think back to the fidelity of God. Think back to the fidelity of Christ. Now, let's just go with that for a second. If you're a first century Christian, fine, right? Now you could make an argument that the biblical text is providing evidence. It's not providing evidence in the now. What it's doing, it's providing evidence of what has gone, before, so that you will continue to have this faith moving forward based on the fidelity of that object. We're not there, right? We're 2,000 years removed from that. So the idea that there's this extra...
Even if we were there, we're told that we can tell the mountain to jump into the sea, and it will happen if you believe hard enough. Now, is the word pistis involved in that at all?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you see in the synoptics is that you can have more or less faith. I mean, that's the faith of the mustard seed. I mean, the pistis of the mustard seed. I mean, I haven't looked at that particular verse, but I'll just look.
Yeah, and what does it matter? I mean, if you have, he says, if you have but the faith of a mustard seed, which again doesn't matter or doesn't relate to what we're talking about, or the way that I define faith, or the way that I shouldn't say that I define it, because other people defined the common English language use of faith as a belief that is not dependent on scientific evidence long before me, and they didn't consult me. But there are a handful of Inspiring Philosophies fans who want to say that this definition that I quoted from dozens and dozens of classic sources
it's somehow they all consulted me, I guess, because I made that. That's my own personal definition that dictionaries and scholars and so forth were using long before I was born.
I mean, I'm no expert in oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Aquinas is I'm trying to think of. But even Aquinas, I just doing a little bit of reading, there's a definite distinction, I think. In fact, I've wrote something down that he said here. And again, I haven't read this in all of its context, but he's discussing specifically what faith is, and is faith something that is seen, something that is not seen. So again, I always say this: I'm not an expert in Thomas Aquinas' writing. So, but
I've read a number of things from Saint Augustine, wherein he talks about faith being a belief that is without proof. And if certainly Augustine would be a respected scholar in this, although he didn't speak Greek. So somehow the meaning of the Greek word is independent both of the common English word and the previous Hebrew word. And I don't get how that's supposed to be significantly different.
But let's just camp on that for a second, because I think actually that's a really good point. This is sort of the thing that I really questioned throughout that section of the discussion. And there's a great distinction between how we use faith today and the object of that faith, not necessarily the object, but the access perhaps we have to the fidelity of that object, to the evidence of the fidelity of that object, of God, and how it's presented in the New Testament text. Right? The way that it's presented in the biblical text is you have these experiences, like actual experiences with the divine. You see him walking on water. You see him healing the sick, raising the dead.
I have to wonder whether anybody's actually seeing that either, because when you read Paul, he was such a mystic. I mean, he would take dreams, he would take hallucinations, and declare that as if that's evident, as if that was genuine communication.
But I mean, even if we just grant, that's why I was saying, like, even if we just grant the entirety of the New Testament, just grant it, and the difference in the faith that those individuals had, I think it would be incorrect to say that today, when we use faith and we talk about what people have to do in order to have faith in a religion, that we would use the word pistis to try to wrestle with that, to try to equate those two, because the way that faith is being presented in the biblical text is you have this background. Again, assuming, just going with the text, just going with how they present it. These disciples are walking around with him, right? And they're watching him do all these miracles. And it's interesting, even then they don't believe, right? Even then they don't have enough to actually, they see him do all these miraculous things, and then the water starts to get kind of rough, and they go, "Oh, we're going to die." And he says, "You cowards, have more faith."
What would it be? I mean, because this is the realistic way of looking at it. I mean, Jesus was, if he existed at all, he was a first century faith healer, which means that he would have been every bit the scam artist that modern faith healers are, right? There's times that he can't even faith heal people. And then he has to make the admission that, how do you call himself, a physician or a doctor or something, a healer, is not welcome in his own hometown, or can't perform any miracles in his own hometown. And that's because familiarity breeds contempt. And people recognize him. Aren't you the shyster that grew up here? We know you're a bullshitter. We're not going to believe you, right? So this is the way I see it. I mean, so when you hang out with a faith healer, if you were hanging out with, any of the modern faith healers in the 70s or 80s, when the police come knocking, your people are going to abandon you because they know that it's all a game of pretend. Oral Roberts made the confession that when he was asked by one of his believers who was happening to work security, but this guy just wanted one example of a person who was medically documented to have been unable to walk, medically documented to have been in a wheelchair for years, that we can prove that this person actually spent years in a wheelchair, met Oral Roberts, and could walk after that. He said you just wanted one name, one person that he could verify. And the answer, of course, was Oral Roberts said there's a lot of exaggeration in this business. Right? It's an exaggeration, and it's a business. It's a bullshit scam. That's what it is. And that's what it has always been ever since Jesus.
I used to watch, I know this is this side, but I used to watch a lot of the Trinity Broadcasting Network to kind of giggle. And
I do it just to get mad.
But I always find it funny that Benny Hinn, he never heals somebody that doesn't have an arm, and then they grow an arm on stage. Right? That never happens. It's always that they can't hear out of their right ear, or they can't see really well out of their left eye, and then all of a sudden,
one leg shorter than the other. Did you ever see that one?
No.
Okay, so there's the thing, you just arch your pelvis a little bit, and then it looks like one leg is longer than the other, and then while they're praying, you just change the position of your pelvis, and then your leg appears to be the same. I mean, this is a common scam. It's done a lot. A lot of these traveling, revival things do that
like tent
trick,
meeting stuff,
right? I mean, and then Bobby Tilton claimed that he'd seen midgets grow in his faith healing. No, you haven't. There's no documentation to back that. There's literally no truth to the whole thing. And that's my position. The truth is what the facts are, right? Show me the fact. That's the evidence. That's the thing we can show to be true. Show me the truth of your religion. And none of these people can. And that's why they get so angry when I point out that there is no evidence for this position. And I think they just don't want to admit what it really is. So they all go around cowing to each other about how I'm wrong, but the only way they can say that I'm wrong is by strawmanning my position.
Yeah, I get, if I had to speculate or theorize maybe about, I'm probably using both of those words wrong in this context, but why it is that there was a reaction. It seems like I haven't been in the YouTube game for very, very long, but one of the things that I have noticed from the apologists that I've watched is that so much, it seems like what they're trying to do is to say, we do have evidence. It seems like a lot of it ends up being, logical syllogisms that seem to imply certain things, but
based on false premises, no less. So
it does seem that happens. But it ends up being that it seems like there's this movement away from embracing that faith is required, and not arguments. Yeah, I feel like
I've had to explain to many believers that arguments are not evidence. And the most common one is the God of the gaps. Here's evidence of God. You can't explain this. Ignorance is not evidence.
I think at the end of the day, for me, and it kind of going back to the conversation that I had with this friend of mine from Hopkins, again, strong evangelical Christian, and I respect the hell out of him, though I disagree with him, is that at the end of the day, he says, yeah, it's faith, right? I mean, I can't prove God to you. I don't even know what that would mean. But I've had an experience with him that I know to be real, and I know that.
I was a neo-pagan occultist once upon a time. I had plenty of personal subjective evidence of paranormal experiences that I had witnessed myself to use as my own subjective evidence. But of course, none of that could bear scientific scrutiny.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And I think even if I'm not mistaken, Erick, when he was on with you, said, well, of course you can't use, didn't he say that? Of course you can't use scientific. I think maybe even, did IP even say that? Like you can't use scientific to prove the supernatural. So I feel like
the thing is you actually can. There are a number of specific claims that there are several supernatural claims that can be tested scientifically.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, that's what Louis Pasteur was famous for, disproving a supernatural claim. He disproved one of the claims of vitalism, that the old belief was that when something dies, anything that's died, whether it's been digested or whatever, so poop, rotting fruit, of course, dead animals, whatever, the reason that they smell bad is because their life force is ebbing out, and the life force smells bad. And that life force can turn into vile forms of life like maggots, mold, and mice. And so Louis Pasteur disproved that, which is not spontaneous generation, was a supernatural belief in life force, part of vitalism. It has absolutely nothing to do with how, the scientific explanation of how life came about from prior matrix. It was proposed by Rudy Virchow, who didn't believe in spontaneous generation. So, but people are going to misrepresent however they want in order to preserve their belief.
I just think at the end of the day, to kind of maybe tie this all together for me anyway. At the end of the day, I think that Pistis in the New Testament, Pistis as it is used there in the biblical text, it has a range of meanings, but really, it's very often you're talking about the fidelity of an object of faith, Christ, God, or you're talking about that belief that you have, and often in that object, and oftentimes in spite of evidence to the contrary around you.
And just to be clear, there is not one exceptional moment when faith is dependent on evidence, or when you are permitted to allow evidence to counter a faith-based belief.
No, I mean, I think that's the point of it, is that stand fast, stand firm, even though it seems weird that God hasn't come back in all this time, or it seems like the waves are going to take you down, or it seems like you have a wife that's, past childbearing age, and I tell you that you're going to have a son, and not only are you going to have a son, but you're going to have descendants like the seashore. All of the things around you. I mean, think about it. Genesis 22, when that test. There's so much of faith in the Old Testament is about testing. But Abraham is told, after all this, after all these promises that God has made about descendants, in the face of all these. Sarah laughs, right? She laughs. I'm going to have it. Give me a break. And even after all of that, when he's born, he's growing up, and God says, take him up there and kill him. I mean, and this is the point. This is why Abraham's faith is such a magnificent thing in the biblical text, because on so many different occasions, he looks at things as though they're not, because he trusts in that God that he counts to be faithful, that he counts to be worthy of that belief. And I don't see, this is the thing. I think, and I'm speaking from a position that I think is supporting the Christian faith now, faith in general, right? That's what I'm going to do. Surprise, surprise. I think that Christians, you do a disservice to put down faith like this. That's how this comes across to me. This is my opinion. When you hang so much, when you try to minimize faith, and say, no, faith, you get tons of evidence with faith, right? You that's the whole point. You get all this evidence. I think that's doing it a disservice. You have evidence of the fidelity of the object of your faith, the thing that's allowing you to move forward. But the things that you're believing and the promises that are being given are things that you can't see. And I think you do it a disservice to downplay that, because I think that's actually a really beautiful, just from a literary standpoint, it's a beautiful thing to see with Abraham. And the New Testament writers pick up on it. Do I think that makes Christianity true? No. But I think it does a disservice to try to say, no, faith is something that, you don't, the way that it comes across is you don't really need faith in the way that we think about it. You can prove what it is that you're hoping for. And I don't see that being the case.
I also have to look at the idea that anybody that is willing to kill their own children because the voices in their head told them to is not somebody that you want to base the 3 of the major religions on.